Black CEO goes undercover and witnesses a shocking act of racism. Then, she takes action. The sun had barely begun to rise over the city when Camille Warren stepped into the grand lobby of the company she had built from the ground up. Dressed in a modest blouse and slacks, her hair tucked neatly beneath a simple brown wig, she looked nothing like the powerful CEO whose name was etched in gold on the glass doors behind her. To everyone around her, she was just another temporary office worker. A new face, unimportant, invisible. And that was exactly what she wanted. Camille had spent years fostering what she believed was an inclusive and respectful workplace. She prided herself on her company's values, on the speeches she had given about diversity and dignity. But recently, murmurs had reached her ears, whispers of discrimination, of condescension, of an undercurrent of disrespect toward employees who weren't seen as important. She could have ordered an investigation. She could have called a meeting. But Camille knew that, in corporate settings, people rarely tell the truth when power is watching. If she wanted to see the real face of her company, she needed to become part of the background. So today, she was Lisa Davis, a data entry temp hired through an outside agency. No one would recognize her in this role. After all, how many executives truly take the time to memorize the faces of those who only pass through for a few months? She walked through the halls, clutching a cheap bag, her usual designer heels replaced by worn-out flats. She felt the difference immediately. The polite nods she usually received were gone. No one greeted her. It was as if she had disappeared. By lunchtime, she had already started to notice things. The way the Black and Hispanic janitors moved quickly, keeping their heads down, while younger white employees walked past them as if they didn't exist. The way some people spoke to the receptionist, a Latina woman in her 40s, as though she were a machine instead of a human being. Still, nothing could have prepared her for what happened in the break room. Camille had stepped inside to grab a cup of coffee, trying to blend in, when she heard laughter, sharp, mean-spirited laughter. She turned toward the noise and saw 3 employees, all young white men in crisp shirts and loosened ties, gathered around a small elderly black woman. She recognized the woman immediately. Miss Ruth. Miss Ruth had been with the company since before Camille even made her first million. She had been a quiet, steady presence in the building, always smiling, always working. At 66, she should have been thinking about retirement, not spending her days scrubbing coffee stains out of office carpets. But today, there was no smile on Miss Ruth's face. Her hands trembled as she tried to wipe at the water dripping down her forehead, soaking into her uniform. A bottle of water, now empty, lay at her feet. One of the men let out another laugh. "Come on, Miss Ruth, it's just a little water. Thought you could use some cooling off." The others snickered. One even mimicked her slow, careful movements, mocking her as if she were some sort of joke. Camille felt her pulse hammering in her ears. For a moment, she couldn't move. Then Miss Ruth whispered, "Please, just let me clean up." And that was it. Camille stepped forward before she even realized what she was doing. "Hey," she said, her voice sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" The laughter stopped. The 3 men turned to her, their expressions shifting from amusement to mild annoyance. One of them, a tall one with slick-back hair, gave her a once-over, clearly unimpressed by what he saw. "Who are you?" Camille didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Miss Ruth. "Are you all right?" The older woman opened her mouth as if to respond, but before she could, another one of the men, shorter, with a smug smirk, snorted. "Oh, great." Another one trying to be a hero. Camille's jaw tightened. "I asked you a question," she said, her tone deadly calm. The tall one rolled his eyes. "Relax, lady. We're just having some fun. You temps are so uptight." Camille didn't blink. "You think this is fun?" she asked, her voice colder now. "Bullying an elderly woman? Pouring water on her like she's some animal?" A flicker of something, hesitation, perhaps, crossed one of their faces. But the others weren't fazed. "She's just the cleaning lady," the short one said, grinning. And that was when Camille knew. This wasn't just about Miss Ruth. This was about how they saw people like her. Like Camille, before she had money and power. Just a cleaning lady. Just a temp. Just another nobody. She inhaled slowly, fighting the anger threatening to spill over. They didn't know who she was. But they were about to find out. Camille Warren had never been ignored in her own building before. As she walked through the sleek, glass-lined hallways of her company's headquarters, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation: invisibility. It was eerie. As CEO, she was used to people perking up when she entered a room. Employees would greet her with eager smiles, their backs straightening, their voices respectful. Some looked at her with admiration, others with nervousness, but they always looked. Now, as Lisa Davis, the quiet temp from the agency, she may as well have been a shadow. The receptionist didn't even glance up when Camille approached the front desk, chewing her gum lazily as she scrolled through her phone. Excuse me?" Camille said. The woman sighed as if she had been asked to move a mountain and flicked her gaze toward her. "Yeah? I'm Lisa Davis. The new temp in data entry." The receptionist barely nodded, already looking away. "Check-in's online. Just go straight through. No welcome. No smile. No acknowledgement." Camille tightened her grip on her cheap tote bag and walked past the desk. The contrast was jarring. Had she walked in as herself, as Camille Warren, there would have been a chorus of polite good mornings. The receptionist would have jumped to attention, smiling so hard her cheeks might ache. But Lisa Davis? She was nobody. She stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the third floor. The doors slid shut, and Camille took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was exactly why she had come here. She needed to see how different the experience was for those without power, without a name people feared or respected. And so far, it wasn't looking good. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened to the third-floor office, a sprawling open-concept workspace filled with rows of desks, glowing computer screens, and the constant hum of phones ringing. No one paid her any mind as she stepped in. A tall, thin man in his early 40s sat at a desk near the entrance, typing furiously on his keyboard. His nameplate read Kevin Raines, Senior Data Manager. Camille cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Raines?" He didn't look up. "What?" "I'm Lisa Davis. I was sent by the temp agency. I believe I'm supposed to report to you." Now he looked up, his expression flat and uninterested. "Oh. Right." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Sit over there. You'll be processing invoices. If you have questions, ask someone else. I'm busy." And just like that, he went back to his screen. Camille blinked. No introductions? No instructions? Just sit down and figure it out? She had seen her fair share of disorganized managers, but this was something else. "Still," she nodded. "Understood." She made her way to the empty desk in the back, setting down her bag. The chair was stiff, the computer screen slightly dusty, as if it hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Camille logged in using the credentials HR had emailed her. The system was outdated, clunky. She frowned as she clicked through the files, trying to orient herself. No training manual. No onboarding email. They had just dumped her here with no guidance. As she started clicking through invoices, she tuned into the conversations around her. And that's when she began to notice something disturbing. Across the room, two young men in crisp button-down shirts leaned against a cubicle, whispering and laughing. "Did you see that janitor this morning?" one of them snickered. "Took him 5 minutes to mop up one spill. Slow as hell. Probably doesn't even speak English," the other muttered, shaking his head. Camille's fingers stilled on the keyboard. Her jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain still, to keep typing, to listen. She didn't recognize the janitor they were talking about, but she knew there was only one black custodian on this floor. a man named Marcus, who had been with the company for over 10 years. The conversation shifted to something else, but the unease in Camille's gut remained. A few desks away, a young black woman with curly hair sat quietly at her station. Camille had noticed her earlier. She had been one of the few people in the office who had glanced up when Camille entered. Now, a blonde woman in a navy blazer leaned over her desk, her voice sweet but condescending. "I just think you should smile more, Kara," she said. "You look so unapproachable sometimes." Kara, the black woman, gave a tight, polite smile. "I'm just focused on my work." The blonde woman chuckled. "Well, don't be too serious. We're all friends here." Camille exhaled slowly. She had seen this play out before. It wasn't overt racism. It was something subtler: microaggressions, dismissive attitudes, a quiet erosion of respect. She worked in this very building, and yet, if she hadn't gone undercover, she would have never seen this side of it. And then there was Miss Ruth. Camille had spotted her earlier, walking carefully down the hallway, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. She had been here for decades, always working, always kind. But today, no one acknowledged her. Not a single employee stopped to thank her when she wiped down the break room table. Not a single person offered a smile. The worst part? Miss Ruth didn't even seem surprised. She just kept her head down and kept working. Camille's heart tightened. This wasn't a workplace where everyone was respected. This was a workplace where some people were treated as if they didn't matter. Camille had seen enough. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper. And soon, very soon, the people who had made this culture so toxic would find out exactly who had been watching them. The break room smelled of stale coffee and reheated leftovers. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence between conversations, and Camille, sitting alone at a corner table, sipping from a cheap styrofoam cup, felt an eerie sense of detachment. She had spent the entire morning watching, observing, and what she had seen confirmed her worst fears. The culture in her company was broken. The casual disrespect, the dismissive attitudes, the way some people moved through these hallways as if they owned them while others scurried like ghosts, hoping not to be noticed. She had felt invisible all day. And she wasn't the only one. A cleaning cart squeaked across the tile floor, and Camille's eyes lifted instinctively. Miss Ruth. The older woman moved with slow precision, her frail hands gripping the mop handle as she wiped up a spill near the refrigerator. Her uniform was neat but slightly oversized, as if it had been handed down from a previous worker. No one greeted her. No one acknowledged her. She was just part of the background. Camille exhaled quietly, setting her cup down. Then the laughter started. It was sharp, cutting, unmistakably cruel. 3 men stood near the counter, young, confident, dressed in crisp white button-downs with their ties loosened like they had already decided the workday was over. Camille had seen them before. They worked in sales. Mid-level employees who acted like they ran the place, who moved through the office with an arrogance that suggested they had never once feared for their job security. One of them held a half-full bottle of water. The second man leaned in, smirking. "Come on, man, don't waste it." The third, the tallest of them, grinned. "Oh, I won't." Before Camille could process what was about to happen, the man lifted the bottle and tilted it forward, pouring the water directly onto Miss Ruth's head. A sharp gasp. Miss Ruth jerked in shock, water dripping down her face, soaking into her uniform. Her hands trembled as she reached up, trying to wipe her forehead, but the liquid kept running down, darkening the fabric of her shirt. The men howled with laughter. "Damn, Miss Ruth, you needed to cool off anyway. Look at her. She's shaking, man." "Oh, come on, it's just water. Ain't that right, Miss Ruth?" Miss Ruth took a step back, her breath uneven. "Please, just let me clean." Camille's hands curled into fists. The humiliation on Miss Ruth's face. The way she tried to shrink into herself, to make herself smaller, to disappear. Camille had seen that look before. She had seen it in herself, decades ago, when she was just another young black woman trying to survive in corporate America. When she had been spoken down to, dismissed, humiliated, before she built her empire. Before she made them see her. Something inside her snapped. She shot up from her seat so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. The laughter stopped. 3 sets of eyes turned toward her, their amusement shifting to mild irritation. "Who the hell are you?" the tallest man scoffed. Camille ignored him. She turned to Miss Ruth, her voice gentle. "Are you okay?" Miss Ruth blinked, looking at Camille as if seeing her for the first time. Her lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. She just shook her head. Camille turned back to the men. "You think that's funny?" Her voice was low, controlled, dangerous. The tallest one smirked. "Relax, lady. It's just a joke." "A joke?" Camille repeated. "Pouring water on an elderly woman is a joke to you?" The shorter man, the one with the smug grin, crossed his arms. "Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. She's just the cleaning lady." "Just." That word again. Camille felt a cold, simmering rage rise in her chest. Miss Ruth wasn't just anything. She was a human being. A woman who had worked hard her entire life. A woman who deserved respect. And these men, these arrogant, privileged men, had stripped her of that, all for their own amusement. "You need to walk away," Camille said quietly. The smirking man chuckled. "Or what? You gonna report us to HR?" He said it mockingly because he knew HR wouldn't care. Camille took a step forward. "Walk away," she repeated. The tallest one tilted his head, as if considering whether it was worth arguing. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he rolled his eyes. "Whatever." They turned, still chuckling to themselves, and strolled out of the break room like nothing had happened. Like they had done nothing wrong. Camille stood there for a moment, heart pounding. Then she turned back to Miss Ruth. The older woman still looked shaken, her hands gripping the mop handle tightly. "Miss Ruth," Camille said gently. "Come sit for a second." Miss Ruth hesitated. I should finish cleaning." Camille's voice softened. "Please." Finally, Miss Ruth nodded. Camille guided her to the chair she had been sitting in earlier and grabbed some napkins from the counter. She handed them to Miss Ruth, who dabbed at the water still clinging to her skin. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Miss Ruth whispered, "Thank you." Camille exhaled slowly, her fingers still curled tightly against her palm. "How long has this been happening?" Miss Ruth shook her head. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." Camille's voice was sharper than she intended. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Miss Ruth, I need you to tell me the truth." Miss Ruth's shoulders sagged. "It's not the first time," she admitted quietly. "But I don't say anything. I just do my work." Camille clenched her jaw. That was the problem. People like these men who had never been held accountable for their actions, depended on silence. And for too long, Miss Ruth had been silent. Not anymore. Camille reached into her bag and pulled out a napkin. She grabbed a pen from the table and quickly wrote something down. Her personal number. "Miss Ruth," she said, placing the napkin in front of the older woman. "If anyone treats you like this again, I want you to call me. No matter what time it is. Understand?" Miss Ruth hesitated. Then she picked up the napkin and nodded. Camille exhaled. "Good." She stood, her pulse still thrumming with anger. This was bigger than one incident. Bigger than just Miss Ruth. There was a sickness in this office, one that had festered for too long. And Camille was about to cut it out at the root. She had come here to observe. But now she was ready to take action. Camille didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her penthouse apartment, the city lights flickering beyond the tall windows. The image of Miss Ruth, drenched, trembling, humiliated, wouldn't leave her mind. Neither would the smug faces of those men. They didn't think they had done anything wrong. They laughed. They walked away. And worst of all, Miss Ruth had accepted it. Not because she wanted to. Not because she was weak. But because she knew nothing would change. Until now. Camille rose early, dressed in the same modest attire as the day before, and made her way back to the office. This time, her walk through the building felt different. More purposeful. By the time she reached her desk, she had already made up her mind. This ended today. She spent the morning making quiet observations, confirming what she already knew. People like Miss Ruth weren't the only ones suffering. She overheard conversations laced with condescension, white employees belittling colleagues of color, dismissing their ideas, talking over them in meetings. She watched as Kara, the young black woman from data entry, was constantly interrupted and ignored by her supervisor. She saw Marcus, the black janitor, being given the dirtiest, most difficult tasks while his white counterparts took extended breaks. Camille had suspected there was a problem. Now, she knew there was. By lunchtime, she was ready. She took a deep breath, pushed her chair back, and stood. It was time for the confrontation. The break room was buzzing with conversation, the smell of microwaved lunches lingering in the air. Camille walked in, scanning the space. There they were. The three men from yesterday, sitting at a table near the window, laughing over their sandwiches like they didn't have a care in the world. She approached, stopping just beside them. Silence fell as they noticed her. The tall one, Grant, according to the nameplate on his desk, raised an eyebrow. "Oh, look who it is. You come to give us another lecture, temp?" Camille didn't blink. "You need to apologize," she said. The second man, Mark, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "For what?" Camille's expression didn't waver. "For what you did to Miss Ruth." Grant scoffed. "That old bat? Please. She's lucky we even noticed her." A slow, dangerous fire burned in Camille's chest. "You humiliated her," she said, voice steady. "You degraded her in front of an entire room of people. And you think you got away with it." The third man, Lucas, smirked. "And what? You gonna run to HR?" "Lady, we are HR." And there it was. The missing piece. Camille had suspected, but now she had confirmation. These men weren't just random employees. They had power. Power to cover up complaints. Power to dismiss concerns. Power to make sure women like Miss Ruth and workers like Marcus stayed silent. They had been doing this for a long time. Camille's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you?" Grant leaned forward, his smirk widening. "Sweetheart, I know I am." Camille chuckled softly. Then, she reached into her bag and pulled out a phone. A company-issued phone. And with the press of a button, she played back the audio recording of everything that had happened the day before. The laughter. The water pouring. Miss Ruth's trembling voice. And their voices. Clear. Undeniable. Lucas went pale. Mark stiffened. Grant? Grant's smug expression faltered for the first time. Camille let the recording play until the very last second. Then she hit pause and slipped the phone back into her bag. She took a step closer. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Grant swallowed hard. "You're a damn temp, that's who." Camille tilted her head. "Am I?" She reached up, taking off the simple brown wig she had been wearing. Her natural curls fell into place, framing the sharp angles of her face. Then she straightened her posture, the way she always did when walking into board meetings. Recognition dawned across their faces. Grant's mouth opened and closed, eyes wide with disbelief. Lucas whispered, "Oh, shit." Camille crossed her arms. "My name is Camille Warren." She let the words settle, watching as the blood drained from their faces. "And you all work for me." The break room had gone completely silent. Employees at nearby tables had stopped talking, their eyes darting between Camille and the three men, whispering among themselves. Camille let the moment stretch, watching them squirm. Then she leaned down, voice deadly quiet. "You will apologize to Miss Ruth," she said. "And you will do it right now." Grant's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "You will apologize," Camille repeated. "Or I will make sure none of you ever work in this industry again." She meant it. These men weren't just employees. They were high enough in the company to think they were untouchable. But she was the CEO. And she had just touched them. Grant stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. His face was red now, the anger barely concealed under his forced humility. "Fine," he muttered. Lucas and Mark scrambled to follow. Camille turned and walked toward the janitor's closet where she knew Miss Ruth was. When she reached the doorway, she knocked gently. Miss Ruth peeked out, eyes widening when she saw the group standing behind Camille. Grant coughed. His voice came out tight. "Miss Ruth." Camille raised an eyebrow. Grant clenched his fists at his sides. "I apologize. For, yesterday." Lucas mumbled something similar. Mark looked like he was about to vomit. Camille looked at Miss Ruth. Miss Ruth studied them for a long moment. Then she straightened her back. She wasn't trembling anymore. "I accept your apology," she said simply. Camille smiled. Then she turned back to the men. "You're fired." Grant jerked back as if he had been slapped. "What?" "Pack your things," Camille said, voice cool. "Security will escort you out." Lucas started sputtering. "You can't." "I can." Camille smiled. "And I did." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Security. The men panicked, but it was over. They thought they were untouchable. But today, they had learned the truth. As they were led out of the building, Camille turned to Miss Ruth. "You okay?" Miss Ruth took a deep breath. Then she nodded. For the first time in a long time, Camille saw something new in her eyes. Dignity. Respect. Freedom. Camille patted her arm. "Come on. We have a company to fix." Miss Ruth smiled. "Yes, ma'am." And together, they walked forward. Because change had finally come. Camille didn't waste any time. After the security guards escorted the three men out of the building, she walked straight to the executive boardroom on the top floor. The room, usually reserved for high-level meetings, had a long, polished oak table surrounded by expensive leather chairs. The walls were lined with plaques and awards, recognizing the company's achievements. Camille had always been proud of this space. But today, all she could see was the hypocrisy. The values etched into the plaques: integrity, respect, excellence, felt like a joke. Because beneath the shiny exterior, her company had allowed something toxic to take root. Not anymore. She picked up the phone on the conference table and dialed her assistant. "Valerie, send an urgent email," she said, her voice sharp. "Every department head, every executive, every HR leader, I want them in the boardroom in 10 minutes. There was a pause. Then Valerie, ever efficient, responded. "Yes, ma'am. Right away." Camille hung up. Then she took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was about to come. This was going to be ugly. And she was ready for it. 10 minutes later, the boardroom was packed. Senior executives, managers, HR directors, all of them seated, murmuring among themselves. Some looked confused. Others, nervous. Camille stepped to the head of the table and cleared her throat. Silence fell. She let the quiet stretch for a moment, letting them feel the weight of it. Then, she spoke. Yesterday, she began, I went undercover in my own company. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Murmurs. Shifting in chairs. Camille continued. I disguised myself as a temp worker to see how this company operates when people don't know they're being watched. More murmurs. A few people looked at each other, uneasy. And what I saw, Camille said, voice growing colder, was unacceptable. She reached into her bag, pulled out her company-issued phone, and tapped the screen. The recording began to play. The entire boardroom listened as the voices of Grant, Lucas, and Mark filled the air. Their laughter. The splashing of water. Miss Ruth's quiet, trembling voice. Camille let the recording play in its entirety. When it ended, she looked around the room. The silence was thick, suffocating. Several executives looked pale. Others were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The head of HR, a middle-aged woman named Diane, finally spoke. Ms. Warren, I don't understand. Why didn't Miss Ruth file a formal complaint? Camille turned her icy stare on her. Because she did. Diane's face drained of color. Miss Ruth, Camille said, reported harassment multiple times. And yet, your department did nothing. A few HR representatives glanced at each other, panicked. Camille continued, her voice like a blade. And it's not just her. I saw it with my own eyes, black employees being dismissed in meetings, overlooked for promotions, forced to endure casual racism while others laughed. She turned to one of the executives, a man named Robert who oversaw hiring. Robert, she said, can you tell me why, in a company of over 3,000 employees, less than 5% of leadership positions are held by black or Hispanic employees? Robert opened his mouth. Closed it. Camille nodded. That's what I thought. Then she turned to Diane again. And can you tell me why HR has rejected every racial discrimination complaint filed in the last 5 years? Diane sputtered. That's not true. Camille pulled out a folder from her bag and dropped it on the table. Every complaint, she said. Each one dismissed without action. More silence. A bead of sweat trickled down Diane's forehead. Camille exhaled sharply. This company, she said, was built on my vision. And that vision was supposed to be one of respect. Of fairness. She scanned the room, making sure to look every person in the eye. But somewhere along the way, we lost that. She straightened her shoulders. So here's what's going to happen. A few people tensed. Effective immediately, Camille said, HR is being restructured. Anyone who has ignored complaints, dismissed concerns, or failed to protect employees, you're gone. Diane made a strangled noise. Ms. Warren. Camille's gaze snapped to her. You're first. Diane's mouth fell open. You can't. I can, Camille said. And I just did. Diane went red, then pale. Then she snatched up her papers and stormed out of the room. Camille turned back to the others. The rest of you, she continued, will be attending mandatory bias training. Every single executive and manager. No exceptions. Someone shifted. If you don't like it, Camille added, there's the door. More silence. Then, slowly, Robert nodded. Then another executive. Camille nodded back. Good. She exhaled. There will be no more just the cleaning lady. No more dismissing people because of their race. No more covering up discrimination. That ends today. She glanced at her watch. This meeting is over. Get to work. People stood, dazed, shuffling out. Some looked shaken. Others thoughtful. But Camille didn't care about their discomfort. She cared about fixing what was broken. As the last person left, Miss Ruth stepped inside. She looked hesitant. Camille smiled. You heard all that? Miss Ruth nodded. I did. She clasped her hands together. I don't know what to say. Camille stepped closer. Say yes, she said. Miss Ruth frowned. Yes? Camille pulled out a contract. A promotion, she said. Head of custodial management. Higher pay. Better hours. Miss Ruth blinked. I don't know. You deserve this, Camille said softly. No more being invisible. No more being silent. Tears welled up in Miss Ruth's eyes. Then, finally, she nodded. Yes. Camille grinned. Good. She shook Miss Ruth's hand. And for the first time in a long time, this company felt like hers again. The sun was setting as Camille stepped out of the boardroom, exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders. The day had been long, draining, necessary. But as she walked down the hallway, the air felt different, lighter. Change had started today. Would it fix everything overnight? No. Would it erase years of mistreatment, casual racism, and buried complaints? No. But it was a start. And sometimes, that was enough. She made her way down to the first floor, where Miss Ruth's small custodial office was located. She found the older woman sitting at her desk, staring at the promotion contract in her hands. Still thinking about it? Camille asked gently. Miss Ruth looked up, eyes filled with something Camille hadn't seen in them before. Hope. I never expected this, she admitted. All these years, I thought, this was just the way things were. Camille sat down across from her. It shouldn't be. Miss Ruth exhaled slowly, nodding. No, it shouldn't. Then, after a moment, she picked up the pen and signed her name. Camille smiled. Good. Now let's get to work. Miss Ruth chuckled. Yes, ma'am. Camille stood, glancing out the window where the last rays of sunlight cast a golden glow over the city. She had built this company. Now, she was going to rebuild it the right way. The real work was just beginning. A week later, Camille walked into the office under her real name. No disguise. No wig. No pretending to be someone else. She walked the halls, and this time, people noticed her, not because she was their CEO, but because she was watching. Really watching. The shifts were small at first. HR was under new leadership, and a new open-door policy had been put into place. Employees who had been ignored for years were finally being heard. Kara, the young black woman from data entry, was given a long-overdue promotion. Marcus, the black janitor, now had equal work distribution with his white counterparts. And Miss Ruth? She had a new office, a new title, and more importantly, she had her dignity. Camille had kept her promise. But she wasn't done. At the next all-company meeting, she stood in front of hundreds of employees, microphone in hand. She took a deep breath and spoke. For years, I thought this company represented my vision of fairness. But I was wrong. I was blind to the problems happening right under my nose. And for that, I take full responsibility. The room was silent. She continued. But I'm here to tell you, things will change. And they're already changing. She looked out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some hopeful. If you have ever felt unheard, overlooked, or disrespected, know this: I see you. I hear you. And I will not allow this company to be a place where people fear speaking up. She paused. This isn't just a business. It's a reflection of all of us. And it's time we make it one we can be proud of. There was a moment of quiet. Then, applause. Loud. Thunderous. The kind that meant something. Camille exhaled, her heart pounding. This was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she knew her company was finally on the right path. And she would never look away again. The story of Camille Warren teaches us a powerful lesson. True leadership is about accountability, integrity, and the courage to confront injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. Many of us, especially those who have lived through decades of social change, know that progress doesn't happen by accident. It requires action. Camille's journey reminds us that ignoring a problem doesn't make it disappear, it allows it to grow. When we see someone being mistreated, whether in the workplace, in our communities, or even within our own families, silence makes us complicit. Change begins when we choose to acknowledge hard truths and stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. Camille's story also highlights the importance of seeing people, really seeing them, not just for the roles they fill, but for their dignity, their worth, and their humanity. It's never too late to create a legacy of fairness and respect. Whether in our past careers, in our daily interactions, or in the values we pass down to our grandchildren, we all have the power to shape a world where everyone is treated with dignity. Because in the end, how we treat others, especially those with less power, defines who we truly are.